The Life of Nico di Angelo from Percy Jackson. Nico di Angelo is a 15-year-old Italian-born Greek demigod and son of Hades and Maria di Angelo. He's also the younger brother of the late Bianca di Angelo and the paternal half-brother of Hazel Levesque. He's also known in the Underworld as the Ghost King after taking the title from Minos in the Battle of the Labyrinth. He's currently in a relationship with Will Solace. Welcome to the Amagi. In today's video, we're going over the life of Nico di Angelo. Before we begin, we publish a new video every day, so be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. The Amagi's reach stretches beyond just this channel, so if you're a fan of us, please consider subscribing to our other channels and following us on all social media. Help us reach our goal of passing 100,000 followers on all of our accounts by the end of the year. And with that out of the way, let's get into the video. Background. Nico di Angelo was born around 1932 on January 28th in Venice, Italy, before World War II, before Hades and his brothers took an oath to have no more demigod children, to Hades and Maria di Angelo, their second child together, their first being his older sister Bianca di Angelo. He was raised in a conservative Catholic home. Hades did make appearances in the household in fear that the other gods would notice that he had a son and a daughter. As a child, Nico was obsessed with pirates and the game Mythomagic, which he would later be introduced to by Percy Jackson in The Titan's Curse. Around the age of 6, Nico visited Diocletian's palace in Split, Croatia. Nico had a warm relationship with his mother as he remembers her smiling down at him while they both walked by the Venetian Grand Canal. In elementary school, he studied Dante, Relocation, and losing his mother. At some point near the beginning of World War II, Nico and his family left Italy for the United States, where they stayed at a fancy hotel in Washington, D.C. Their mother, Maria, died when Zeus struck the hotel they were staying in with lightning in an attempt to kill the siblings, thinking they were too dangerous. However, they were protected by Hades as he erected an impenetrable wall of black energy to shield them from Zeus's bolts, but Hades was not able to protect their mother in time. Afterward, a devastated Hades ordered the Fury Alecto to take Nico and Bianca to the Underworld and bathe them in the river Lethe, in order to wipe away their memories, and told her to give their mom the ancient rites. The Lord of the Dead also swore revenge on Zeus. This later caused him to send monsters to attack and try to kill Thalia Grace, Zeus's daughter. Washington, D.C. and the Lotus Hotel and Casino. In The Titan's Curse, Bianca says that she and Nico had no memories of their mortal parent, and told by a lawyer, Alecto in disguise, in Washington, D.C. that their parents were dead, and had left a bank trust for them. This lawyer would come by once in a while to check on both of them. During this time, Nico and Bianca were enrolled in a boarding school. Meanwhile, Bianca familiarized herself with the city's subway system. In the Blood of Olympus, Nico sees a brief flashback from this time, his sister Bianca laughing as she pulled him across the National Mall. After some time had passed, Hades, hoping one of his children might one day become the child of the eldest gods, referred to in the Great Prophecy, decided to place them in the Lotus Hotel and Casino, and tasked Alecto with the job. Once again disguised as a lawyer, Alecto had Nico and Bianca leave the boarding school and took them all the way to the Lotus Hotel in Las Vegas. After what the siblings thought was a month in the Lotus Hotel, which turned out to be 70 years, they were taken out by Alecto, this time disguised as a different lawyer. Alecto drove Nico and Bianca back east through DC and then up into Maine. They were brought to a military school called Westover Hall, paid for by Hades using what Nico and Bianca thought to be a trust fund left to them by their parents. At this point, Nico became obsessed with Mythomagic, a card game. It was later revealed that Nico had been obsessed with pirates even before he started collecting Mythomagic cards. Bianca mentioned that the summer before she left Westover Hall, during the events of the Sea of Monsters, she and Nico visited Washington, D.C. once again, and were very surprised to see several subway stations that had not been there before. Bianca mentions that during their visit, several monsters disguised as mortals attempt to attack them in an alley. Nico also mentions seeing a bus driver, most likely a satyr in disguise, with ram's horns, although Bianca had not believed him at the time. The Titan's Curse. Nico and his sister, Bianca di Angelo, appear at a school dance at Westover Hall, a boarding school in Bar Harbor, Maine. Grover explained to Percy, Annabeth, and Thalia that he discovered them at the school. but every time he tries going near them, Dr. Thorne keeps blocking him. They saw him arguing on the bleachers, with Nico playing with mythomagic cards. Bianca and Nico were later taken by Dr. Thorne, scared of Percy. Dr. Thorne tried to kidnap them, and Nico stood up for Bianca when Dr. Thorne called her an insufferable girl. Percy tried defending the siblings, and Thalia and Annabeth later jumped in to defend them. Nico got excited when he found out that Dr. Thorne was a manticore, saying that he had 3,000 attack power and 5 saving throws. After they were saved, Percy told Nico and Bianca that they were demigods, and Nico thought it was cool and immediately asked questions about Zeus. Nico also complimented Percy about how he attacked the manticore. Nico was also excited when he heard about Camp Half-Blood and immediately wanted to go. While Artemis spoke to Bianca, Nico went to talk to Grover in the woods about geeky stuff. When they came back, Nico exclaimed that Percy's arm was green while Grover healed it. Nico also showed Percy his collection of mythomagic cards and figurines and asked to see his sword. Nico immediately asked Percy a lot of questions, annoying him, including asking if Annabeth was his girlfriend. Percy almost lost his cool until Zoe Nightshade asked to see Percy. Bianca talked to Nico, explaining her decision to join the Hunters of Artemis, making Nico upset and gloomy. However, Nico was impressed with Apollo and said that he had a cool car. When they got on the bus, Bianca left Nico to sit in the front of the bus with Percy, Thalia, Grover, and Apollo while she sat with the Hunters. Nico asked Apollo a lot of questions about the gods and the sun, making Apollo laugh and ruffle Nico's hair and answer them, not making sense to Nico. Nico asked if he could drive the car, but Apollo said he was too young. When they arrived at camp, Nico asked Percy about the lava climbing wall. Bianca whispered something in Nico's ear, but he scowled and looked away, making Percy wonder what Bianca told him. He also asked who Chiron was, and says he didn't have his figurine. Percy explained it to him, and Nico said if the Hunters didn't like him, it was good enough for him. Percy introduced Nico to Chiron and Dionysus and was taken by Grover to see the orientation film, after asking what rating it was since Bianca was strict. Later, Nico was impressed when finding out that Chiron was a centaur. Nico was also impressed by Dionysus and called him the wine dude, after saying he had his figurine in Mythomagic, and talked to him about the defense points of all the gods in the game. At dinner, Nico sat with Connor and Travis Stoll at the Hermes cabin table, telling him poker was a better game than Mythomagic. The next day, Nico played Capture the Flag on a team with Percy, the Stoll brothers, Charles Beckendorf, Selena Beauregard, and some others. Nico ran up to Percy before the game started, telling him the game was awesome, with a helmet too big for him. Nico asked him if he could kill the other team, but Percy told him it was serious and that swords could hurt. Nico took guard duty with the Stolls and Beckendorf and cheered when Percy crossed the boundary line. The next day, Percy found Nico spying on Bianca and Zoe, arguing about what happened to Phoebe in the early morning. Nico later saw Percy after he removed the invisibility cap and thought it was cool. Nico told Percy he didn't sleep too well and wanted to follow Bianca on the quest, but Percy said he couldn't because she could die, making Nico say Percy should go for him. Nico and Percy argued until Nico asked if he was planning to go anyway, and Percy said yes. Nico said he wouldn't tell on him, but he had to promise to keep Bianca safe. Percy promised, and Nico said he would make an excuse up to Chiron and told him to go. A few days later, Nico ran to find Percy in the big house and asked him where Bianca was. Percy told Nico the news and gave Nico the figurine she wanted him to have. Nico said that he promised to protect her, and though Percy tried to explain, Nico said that he had promised. Nico said he shouldn't have trusted Percy and explained his nightmares and said he hated him, throwing the statue. Nico said he could feel Bianca being judged in the fields of Asphodel, but skeletons interrupted them. Nico opened a crack in the floor of the cabin, making the skeletons disappear. Nico told Percy that he hated him and wished he was dead, then ran away. Percy realized he was a son of Hades and told Grover and Annabeth, but not Chiron. Another reason Nico ran away was for love. He had a crush on Percy and couldn't deal with the feelings towards him, and ran away. Homosexuality was illegal in the 1940s, so he felt great shame for his feelings. He couldn't imagine a man he trusted hurting him and was angry at him for what happened to Bianca, but his feelings for his hero complicated that. Hiding in the Labyrinth. Nico eventually found the entrance to the Labyrinth and found Minos. Minos manipulated Nico and the two traveled together, with Nico barely eating at all. Nico became very depressed during this time, and his anger only grew bigger, as he became convinced that he would never belong at Camp Half-Blood because he was a son of Hades. He even abandoned his mythomagic cards. Nico became very strong during his months away, learning to summon ghosts. He also got his Stygian iron sword. Nico also learned how to shadow travel but ended up in China many times. Nico and Minos would camp out in the Underworld, where Minos would try to manipulate him into doing a soul for a soul to bring Bianca back. Nico's appearance also changed. His hair grew to his shoulders and his skin went from olive to as white as snow. He also donned his signature outfit of his aviator jacket, black jeans, and a skull shirt with a sword on his side. He became very skinny and bony due to his meager diet. While Nico was gone, Percy, Grover, and Annabeth searched for him the entire spring with no luck. Percy thought about Nico a lot, and the crack he made, which still was at the dining pavilion. The Battle of the Labyrinth. Percy found Nico through an iris message sent by Bianca. He found Nico camping in the Underworld along the banks of the river Styx with Minos. He was ripping his mytho-magic cards and throwing them into the river, wondering why he used to like them. Minos agreed that it was a childish game. Nico felt guilty that there was no way to get Bianca back, but Minos suggested yet again that he do a soul for someone who cheated death. Nico was against doing it since it was murder. He asked him why he couldn't just summon Bianca, but Minos insisted that he should get revenge, and that he owes it after everything he did for him. A tear fell down Nico's cheek, and he agreed to do it. The next day, Percy sent another message to Nico, and this time he was digging a hole in a graveyard to summon a ghost. He emptied a few Coke packs and McDonald's Happy Meals so the ghosts would respect him. But ghosts know that McDonald's is cheap and gross, so it didn't work. Minos didn't get why he used animal blood, but Nico said he wanted to treat the dead with respect. He summoned many ghosts, and the first one to speak was Theseus, the Greek hero. He asked how he could bring his sister back, and Theseus said not to try. It was madness. He reluctantly gave advice until he told Nico to release them and that he was coming. Later, Nico unexpectedly meets Percy, Annabeth, Tyson, and Grover at the Triple G Ranch. He'd entered the ranch to discuss finding the soul he needed with Geryon. Percy and his friends went to the ranch due to the chance Nico might be there. When Nico sees them, he's furious, pulls out his sword, and says that they let Bianca die and that they will kill him as well, but Percy reassured him that this was not the case. Though he was still angry, he put away the sword after Geryon ordered him to, but told Percy not to come near him or his helpers would hurt him. Later, Nico became angry at Geryon after he showed him and the others his stables instead of discussing the soul he needed. Percy tried to ask him about it, but Nico refused to give any information, only saying that it wasn't Percy. Geryon ended up imprisoning Nico and the others, threatening to sell Nico to Luke Castellan unless Percy cleaned his stables. Nico didn't want Percy to save him, but he did anyway. After he was saved, Percy tried to tell him to stay at the ranch for his safety, but Nico yelled at Percy after what happened with Bianca, causing Annabeth to come to his defense. After arguing, Percy decided to help Nico summon Bianca's soul after Nico couldn't, telling him she sent him iris messages. That night they went into the field to summon her, but were interrupted by Minos, telling Nico not to trust Percy and his friends. Nico managed to order Minos to leave and the ritual continued. Bianca appeared and Nico was overjoyed to see her, but she was sad, saying he'd gotten tall. Nico was heartbroken when she said that she'd hoped he'd given up on summoning her, saying Percy was right and he cannot hold grudges, since they were the fatal flaw for children of Hades. Nico became angry at her for helping Percy, but Bianca told him to stop blaming him for her choices, since she knows he's mad at her and that could be his doom. Bianca disappeared after Kronos stirred, saying she loved him and to remember what she said. Nico didn't sleep much that night, since the next morning he had red eyes and a chalky face. Before he left, Percy said his goodbyes to Nico, saying he could come with them. Nico said he needed time to think and wouldn't meet Percy's eyes, still a little angry at him. Annabeth put her hand on his shoulder and tried to comfort him, but he walked away. Percy and his friends were worried for him, but Eurydion reassured them that he would be alright. However, Nico was tricked by Minos to return to the maze under the ruse that Percy was in danger, which Annabeth found out after Eurydion told her. Orthus tried to track his scent, but to no avail. He ended up being taken prisoner and dragged to Daedalus's workshop by Kelly, two Iastragonians, and Minos. Nico apologized to Percy and explained he was told she was in danger but was tricked to be turned into Kronos. As they attacked Kelly, Nico struggled with his chains and was pushed to the ground. Nico managed to rise up and break from his chains and defeated Minos, declaring himself the Ghost King, causing the windows to shatter and Minos and his friends to be summoned back to the Underworld. Nico then escaped with Percy, Annabeth, and Rachel Elizabeth Dare. They landed at Pike's Peak, and Nico told the group that he knew Daedalus wasn't dead, but he wasn't sure about Tyson and Grover. He then followed Annabeth to the gift shop to get food. After that, the four returned to the maze and Nico walked behind with Percy. Percy thanked him for helping them, and Nico explained that he owed him for saving him, and Daedalus should die for avoiding death too long. He then explained he knows he will never be accepted at camp, and only the dead respect him. Percy tried to tell him he'd have friends at camp, but Nico asked if he actually believed that. Percy couldn't answer since Nico was scary and sometimes made him uncomfortable. The group then stopped at Mount Orthus, and Nico stayed behind with Rachel and Annabeth as Percy went in. The only thing the three could agree on was to save Percy, and saved everyone by making a fissure of rock rise and made the columns of Orthus fall. Percy told him he revealed himself as a son of Hades, but he brushed him off. After that, they met up with Tyson and Grover and all ended up in the home of Pan, rendering Nico speechless. Pan explained that he should have died long ago, and said Nico understood that. Nico explained he was dying and should have died long ago. Pan addressed all of them except for Nico, and he faded away. They then left the cavern and prepared to return to camp, but Blackjack didn't want him to ride him. Nico told them to return to camp without him, but he agreed after Annabeth insisted, possibly to make Percy jealous. Nico fought bravely in the Battle of the Labyrinth, stabbing a Telkine and summoning many ghosts. The axe weakened him and he crumpled to his knees. After the battle, Tyson beckoned Percy and Annabeth to help Nico, whose clothes were smoking. Nico was healed with nectar and said he'd never summoned that many before, but he'd be fine. They all then headed over to Daedalus, who told Nico he could hold his soul for ransom and use it to bring Bianca back. But Nico refused, saying he will release Daedalus, but Bianca had passed on. After he addressed everyone, Nico released him. That night, Chiron offered that Nico could sit with him, but he refused and went into the forest to say goodbye to Bianca. Percy found him, and Nico told him that he was saying goodbye to Bianca. Percy said that he could have sat with him at dinner and that he cannot miss every meal, but Nico said he wasn't staying. Percy protested, and he argued that he didn't belong at camp and needed to find out about his past. Percy wanted to argue, but knew that he had to find his own dark way. Percy said he hoped they wouldn't be enemies, and Nico apologized for being a brat, saying he should have listened to him. Percy then gave Nico the action figure Bianca got him, but he didn't want it, saying the game was for kids. But after Percy said that it had 1,000 attack power, Nico corrected him, saying 5,000, and Percy said he could still be a kid once in a while, causing him to accept the action figure. Nico promised he'd tell him anything useful, and they shook hands before he left. A few months later, Nico appeared in Percy's fire escape on his birthday to tell him about his plan. He told him Daedalus got his punishment, and was about to tell him his plan when he saw blue cake and questioned it. Percy realized he hadn't been to a birthday party before and invited him inside for cake and ice cream, saying they had a lot to discuss. The Sword of Hades. Nico is one of the 3 demigods along with Thalia and Percy who are summoned by his stepmother Persephone to find the Sword of Hades. When he's first summoned by Persephone, he claims to have been at a graveyard in New Orleans. This could possibly be a reference to Hazel. Naturally, Nico didn't take well to her welcome since she turned him into a dandelion when they last met. Percy thinks it's a bad idea, but Nico is hoping to achieve recognition from his father Hades. He tells Thalia and Percy why they need to go on the quest. To Percy's irritation, he comes up with logical reasons. His knowledge of the Underworld and its occupants helps them complete their quest. He remains in the Underworld afterward to discuss the upcoming Titan War with his father. Before his friends leave, he reminds Percy of his idea to defeat the Titans. The Last Olympian. Nico's theory to gain an edge over the Titans is finally revealed. It is to make Percy invincible by having him bathe in the river Styx, similar to the myth of Achilles. In the Blood of Olympus, it's revealed that Nico knew Percy would not like the plan and worried over how it would affect their relationship, sarcastically saying Percy would really love him for that. It's shown that after Bianca died, Hades believes that he has no competent child, repeatedly mentioning that Bianca could do a better job at fulfilling their father's demands. At some point earlier, Nico began preparing for his plan, and did some research on Luke's past, and had found May Castellan, his mother. Later on, Nico is once more searching for information about his mother and childhood, a quest that brought him to Mount Orthus/Olympus. Nico is first seen there in Percy's dream, using a chance to eavesdrop on the Titans Hyperion and Cryos, as well as the imprisoned Atlas. It's later confirmed that this was true. Shortly after, Beckendorf sacrifices his life to destroy Kronos' ship so that Percy could escape and the enemy ship would be destroyed. Nico speaks to his ghost and learns that Beckendorf will go to Elysium. Nico himself also heard the lines of the Great Prophecy, presumably from another ghost, or Hades himself. Later on, Nico arrives at Camp Half-Blood by shadow travel, which initially terrifies Juniper and Linnaeus, and he briefly discusses Grover's disappearance with them, after which he encounters Percy. Nico is finally able to persuade him to go through with their plan, and both of them and Miss O'Leary shadow travel to Luke's old house to meet his mother, May Castellan. Afterwards, they briefly encounter the goddess Hestia, who greets them warmly and offers them food. Soon after, the three enter the Underworld, where Nico, who wasn't telling Percy everything, had the Furies carry them to Hades' palace. It's revealed that in order to gain information about his past and his mother, Nico had to bring Percy to Hades in exchange. Nico had no ill intentions and only agreed after making Hades promise not to harm his friend. His father reveals that the lawyer who removed Nico and Bianca from the Lotus Hotel and Casino was the Fury Alecto in disguise, but refuses to give him details on his mother's death. After Hades still imprisons Percy in his dungeons, Nico helps break him out, apologizes, and still follows through with his initial plan of having Percy bathe in the Styx and gain the Curse of Achilles. After Percy bathed in the Styx and got the Curse of Achilles, he was able to defeat Hades and his entire army of the dead, leaving Nico shell-shocked. Later, Nico attempts to summon the ghost of his mother, but Bianca's ghost appears and tells him not to. He sees the scene of their mother's death, in which Zeus blasted the hotel she, Hades, and the children were in to pieces. Hades, who realized what was happening too late, only managed to save Nico and Bianca. He then orders Alecto to wipe the memories of the children in the Lethe, including their mother's death. By viewing this scene, Nico finds out who his mother is and returns to Hades' palace. In the Blood of Olympus, it's revealed in a conversation between Hades and Nico that during this time, Nico had repeatedly asked and begged his father to help Percy and the rest of Camp Half-Blood in the Battle of Manhattan. Hades said he had never been so harassed by one of his sons and suspected Nico had feelings for Percy. In the end, Nico is able to convince his father Hades to help the campers in the battle against the Titans. Nico is the first to join the Battle of Manhattan and fearlessly yells out a challenge to Kronos himself. Nico is soon joined by Hades himself, and they both summon wave after wave of undead soldiers, who confront and eventually overwhelm Kronos' forces. After the Titan Lord is defeated by Percy and Luke, who sacrifices himself, Nico accompanies his father to Olympus and sits at his father's feet when Percy and his friends are receiving gifts from the Olympians. Apparently, Nico, through his unwavering loyalty and bravery in battle, has finally gained his father's pride, as Hades even pats Nico on the shoulder, and according to Percy, this is the happiest he's ever seen him. Since Hades is now accepted on Olympus, and Nico is accepted at Camp Half-Blood, Rachel is finally able to break Hades' curse on the Oracle and become the next Oracle of Delphi herself. Apparently, almost all campers are in awe of Nico's fighting in the Battle of Manhattan, as even the Ares kids considered him cool. Nico is last seen when he orders undead workers to build the Hades cabin, made up of solid black obsidian walls with a skull over the door. There are torches inside that blaze with burning green fire that will never extinguish. Between the series. Sadly, Nico's popularity only lasted a few weeks. After that, campers did whatever they could to avoid him and forgot he was at camp. Though a year or so later, Will Solace tells him this never happened. He, in fact, isolated himself. The fact that Percy had begun dating Annabeth did not make Nico feel any better. As a result, Nico takes to only showing up at camp from time to time. Sometime after the Battle of Manhattan, Hades gave Nico a French zombie chauffeur, Jules Albert, for his birthday. As revealed in the Son of Neptune, in the September following the Battle of Manhattan, after Thanatos had been captured and the dead were returning to the world, Nico had gone to the Underworld in hopes of rescuing his sister Bianca, but was unable to do so, because she decided to be reborn and thus couldn't be brought back to life. Instead, Nico found his half-sister Hazel Levesque in the fields of Asphodel, and sensed she was a child of the Underworld, as, unlike the other souls in Asphodel, she remembered her life. Nico felt that she deserved another chance at being a hero and brought her to the overworld. Gaia said that he had selfish reasons for doing this, but it's unknown if he had any, or for what selfish reasons that he did do it for. Maybe because he wanted a chance at having a sister again. Hades gives Nico directions on how to find Camp Jupiter, explains why the Olympians have kept both camps separated for centuries, and forbids him from telling anybody about it, as the time isn't right. Hades also advises his son to introduce himself to the Romans as a son of Pluto, telling Nico that it is important for him to make this connection. As stated by Dakota, Nico took Hazel directly to Camp Jupiter and requested that Reyna and Jason take her in. Thus, Nico became the first Greek demigod since the first demigod civil war to learn about the existence of Roman demigods and to visit Camp Jupiter. He accepts a role as the ambassador of Pluto to the Romans and becomes involved in the camp's political life as senator. The Lost Hero. Annabeth mentions that Nico is searching for Percy along with Tyson, Grover, and the Hunters of Artemis, but otherwise he doesn't appear in this book. It's to be assumed that he doesn't stay at Camp Half-Blood much, as Annabeth said he sometimes shows up, which could only be due to his double duty at Camp Jupiter as ambassador of Pluto. She mentions him as one of the only children of the Big Three, along with Percy, Jackson, and Thalia Grace. Unknowingly to her, Jason Grace is also a child of the Big Three, being the son of Jupiter and Hazel, the daughter of Pluto. The Son of Neptune. Nico meets Percy at Camp Jupiter, where he's visiting his half-sister, Hazel Levesque. Nico is very shocked when he sees Percy, but he introduces himself and holds out his hand. They shook hands, and Percy said that he knew him, but Nico said, "Do you?" not telling him about his past. Hazel tells Nico about how Percy arrived, and Nico tells Percy about Gaia, and how evil she was. He also tells him about how Saturn came back and caused the Second Titan War and the Battle of Mount Orthus. Nico mentions how he told Reyna Ramirez Arellano about the giants being reborn, but she didn't listen to him. Nico also greeted Frank Zhang when he arrived and smiled since he was amused by him and was never uneasy around him. Nico tells Frank to take Percy to dinner while he talks to Hazel, and tells Hazel he's staying overnight. Hazel's stressed about this because she knows that the campers won't like that. Hazel and Nico talked on the roof of Pluto's shrine, where Nico tells Hazel about important things are at work, and he cannot tell Hazel much about Percy, but she must trust him because he's only dangerous to his enemies. Hazel was suspicious, and Nico got moody, making bones pop up from the ground. Nico reassured Hazel that she can make things right and almost calls her Bianca, making Hazel even more bitter, knowing that she will never be like her. Nico tells Hazel how Pluto was going crazy because of everything happening in the Underworld, and that Hazel belonged at Camp Jupiter. After Hazel blacks out, Nico gets very worried and asks her where she was when she woke up. Nico warns Hazel that she should get better at controlling her blackouts. Hazel and Nico ran to the mess hall for dinner, and Nico gave her nectar to heal her cuts after she fell when a gold bar popped up. The two ran for the gates of camp not to be late for roll call. When they arrived, Nico went next to Percy. After Hazel stood for Percy, Nico was proud of her and beamed at her, calling her sis. Hazel wondered if he called Bianca that. While Frank was with Percy, Percy asked many questions about Nico, which Frank didn't know much about the answers. Frank thinks that he isn't like Hazel since Hazel is nicer and better looking, and tells Percy that he's mysterious and makes everyone nervous, but not him. At dinner, Nico sat with Frank, Percy, Hazel, and the Centurion, Dakota. Percy wanted to talk to Nico about if he ever saw him before, and Nico panicked and told him that unless he saw him in the Underworld, they never saw each other. Dakota says how Reyna never knows what to do when Nico arrives, which Nico took no offense to. Nico says that Dakota was helpful standing for Hazel, making Dakota blush. Nico tells Percy that he only learned about Hazel recently, how children of Pluto stick together, and how he had another sister. When Dawn started mentioning Percy's empathy link, Nico had Frank and Hazel get Percy oriented and dragged Dakota, Dawn, and Vitellius to the Praetor's table to talk war strategies, dragging Dawn and Vitellius by the ear. During the war games, Nico watched from the observation tower in the fort with binoculars. After Gwendolyn died and came back to life, Reyna asked Nico if it was a power of Pluto, but Nico says that no one returns from the dead and glanced at Hazel, telling her to stay quiet. When Mars arrived at camp, he glared at Nico while talking about how some people returned from the dead. The next day, Nico participated in the Senate meeting and wore a black toga, sitting with the other senators. Nico tells Reyna that he and Hazel learned about the giants from Pluto, and how the eldest giant, Alcyonius, was born opposite to Pluto. Reyna was suspicious and told him that he sounded quite familiar with him. Nico tells the others how only a demigod and a god together can kill a giant, and how it has happened before in the first giant war. Nico also explains to Percy how Pluto is the god of the dead, but Thanatos is the god of death, but he was captured. Nico also says how it's easier for ghosts to escape your underworld, and how Gaia and her forces captured the doors of death, making monsters escape. Before Hazel left, Nico wished her luck and said that he would head back to your underworld to help his father with helping the Furies. Nico also planned to track escaping souls and to find the doors of death. Hazel told him to be careful, but Nico said he knew how to hide. Nico was also worried that after she saved Thanatos, he would never see her again, and she would go back to the dead. Nico said goodbye and melted into the shadows. Nico is later shown in one of Hazel's flashback blackouts. He finds Hazel in the fields of Asphodel and brings her back to the mortal world to give her another chance at life. Hazel later learns that he's in Rome. Percy becomes angry at him when he regains his memories. Journey through Tartarus and Europe. As Nico was looking for the doors of death in the Underworld, he was sucked into Tartarus while looking for the doors. Nico had to drink fire from the river Phlegethon, which pained him very much. Nico saw Tartarus without the veil of mist like Percy and Annabeth did, and saw how it really was, the body of a god. When Percy briefly saw it like that when he experienced the place, he realized that was how Nico saw it, and thought that if he almost went insane by seeing it for just a second, he couldn't imagine how Nico felt. Nico almost went insane from the sheer amount of Gaia's forces, but managed to get very far into Tartarus and met Aklis, the goddess of misery. However, instead of trying to torture him, she complimented him in the sheer level of misery he had inside of him and how he was perfect. She couldn't add any more misery to him. Eventually, Nico was captured by Otis and Ephialtes, who took him through the doors and dragged him through the House of Hades, where they took him to Rome in the Colosseum and put him in a bronze jar and guarded it, where he would die on the calends of July. They used him as a trap to bait the seven. Nico lost a lot of weight and ate pomegranate seeds, going into a death trance to breathe as little as possible. Nico almost gave up hope while in the jar. The Mark of Athena. Percy sees Nico in his dream, imprisoned in the jar in a coma-like state. He had marked 3 scratches on the wall of the jar, 1 for each pomegranate seed he had eaten. The seeds are a last resort food, which only children of Hades or Pluto can eat. Hazel explains that the seeds last for up to 1 day and put him in a death-like state so that he doesn't use up all his air, something Hazel calls a death trance. Piper mentions that the lines of the prophecy now make sense. Twins snuff out the angel's breath, who holds the key to endless death, as Nico's last name is Di Angelo, and Angelo is Italian for angel. Jason and Leo are wary of Nico and mention how he went between the camps, calling it shady and questioning whether he's trustworthy. Hazel is outraged at this, saying Nico is her brother and saved her before storming out of the room. Ultimately, Jason and Leo apologize to her, and the 7 agree that Nico is important to closing the doors of death and that they must save him. So, despite knowing that it's a trap, the 7 head to Rome to rescue Nico. After getting there, Hazel, Frank, and Leo try to find Nico, which leads them to the Pantheon, but they're led into a trap and almost killed by Eidolons. After defeating them, Leo realizes that Hazel was trying to track Nico by using his sword as a beacon, which they find lying in the workshop. Instead, Percy, Jason, and Piper come to Nico's rescue underneath the Colosseum. During Percy and Jason's battle against Otis and Ephialtes, the jar Nico was held in breaks open and Nico falls out. Percy is shocked at his state and can't tell if he's alive or dead. Piper McLean manages to pull the incredibly weakened but alive Nico to safety. Later, back on the ship, Nico tells them how he was captured and what he now knows about the Doors of Death. Nico had found out that the Doors of Death have 2 sides, one in the mortal world and one in Tartarus. The mortal side of the portal is in Greece at a temple called the House of Hades and is heavily guarded by Gaia's forces. Nico then says that the other side of the doors is in Tartarus, a place not even the gods go, and that is why Hades has not been able to close the doors. Not even the god of death, Thanatos, would go near Tartarus. Leo guesses that the 7 heroes will have to go to Tartarus and close that side of the portal, but Nico says that it would be impossible and not even they would stand a chance down there because of the strength and sheer number of monsters. Percy then says that they can set sail for the House of Hades, defeat Gaia's forces, and close the door on the mortal side. However, Nico says that it's not that easy, and that the Doors of Death have to be controlled on both sides to be closed as they're like a double seal. He says that maybe all 8 of them working together could defeat Gaia's forces on the mortal side, but they would need a team fighting simultaneously on the Tartarus side, a team powerful enough to defeat a legion of monsters in their home territory. In Arachne's lair, when Percy tries to save Annabeth from falling into Tartarus, Percy catches a hold of the ledge just in time. Nico tries to help, but he's out of reach. Annabeth tells Percy to let go, but Percy says that he will not lose her again. Percy tells Nico that they will meet the rest of the seven and Nico on the other side of the doors, and makes him promise to lead the others to the mortal side. Nico promises, and Percy lets go, allowing the dark gravity of Tartarus to pull him and Annabeth in. During a meeting on the Argo II, Nico admits that Percy is the most powerful demigod he has ever met, and with Annabeth there with him, they will survive. He believes that if anybody could make it through Tartarus, it would be them. He assures Leo that both Percy and Annabeth are still alive. The House of Hades. The Argo II is being attacked by Numina Montanums, or mountain gods, who are attacking with boulders. As they attack, a boulder hits the mast, causing it to collapse, and Nico, who is in the rigging, falls with it. Hazel Levesque runs to help Nico up from the debris, but he tells her that he's fine. When Leo complains that masts don't grow on trees, Nico corrects him by saying that masts are made from trees, which only serves to annoy Leo further. Leo is forced to retreat again, and the three of them try to think of an alternative way past the Earth gods. Nico explains that they don't like them because children of Hades or Pluto get under their skin, but adds that the Athena Parthenos was most likely attracting more attention. When it's suggested that they take the Argo II around the mountains over the water, Nico explains that going that way is longer, and without their sea expert Percy, it might be too dangerous. Nico also complains that he's too weak to simply shadow travel the ship across the mountains. While coming up with ideas, Hazel tries to think of a way to help, not wanting her only contribution to be removing a dangerous obstacle Nico had told her was in the House of Hades. When Hazel prays to her father for help, Arion appears, running towards them. When Hazel comes back, Leo and Nico help her to her feet when she falls down. Nico asks her what she saw from Hecate, but Hazel refuses to tell any information and tells him to get some rest. Later on, Nico meets Jason, Leo, Frank, and Hazel for breakfast on the ship. Nico sat at the back of the table with his sword by his side, creeping Leo out. Nico tells the group how he met with a former priest of Hecate the night before, and learned about things they would need to do to go through the House of Hades, and the history behind the place. Leo made jokes about it, but Jason made him stop. While talking, the ship lurched and Nico fell against the wall, banging his head. Hazel rushed to help him, while Leo ran to help Piper and Gleason Hedge. The ship soon arrived in Venice, and Nico sat in the harbor with everyone else and surprised Frank by revealing he knows Italian. Nico volunteers to go with Frank to find the Black House, and Hazel goes with, relieving a creeped-out Frank. The three walked through Venice while Nico led them to the house, and Nico mentioned that Venice was filled with lemurs that his mother told him about. Nico told the two that Hades met his mother in Venice in the 1930s and they had him and Bianca, but doesn't remember much about Italy. Hazel and Nico were later attacked by monsters, and Hazel was poisoned, and Nico couldn't stop it. Nico screamed for Frank and told him what had happened, making Frank want to kill the son of Hades. Nico told Frank to get back to the ship with Hazel, but a man leads them to the Black House. Nico finally remembers that the monsters were catobleps, and said he knew them from mythomagic. Frank tells Nico that he played the game but didn't have the card, and Nico says it was from the Africanus Extreme Expansion deck. Nico begs the man to cure Hazel, but he refuses when he finds out that she's a child of Pluto. Nico begs more and is turned into a corn plant. Nico is later turned back to normal by him after Frank fixes his chariot, and Nico mentions having a strange nightmare about popcorn. Nico calls Frank brave for killing the monsters and is in shock when he realized he killed all of them but tried breaking the tension between Hazel and Frank by asking what barley looked like. After Nico was turned into a plant, Nico became more reclusive than usual and spent most of his time on the masts, away from the rest of the crew. Nico later discussed with the crew what to do about Skyron. The Argo II arrived in Croatia to fetch Diocletian's scepter. Nico mentioned the legend about the scepter and told Jason that he would need his help if he wanted to find it. Jason was creeped out by Nico but reluctantly decided to go with him. They arrived at Split, and after they saw a strange man, Jason picked up Nico and flew him to find out how to get to Dalmatia, causing Nico to freak out about being touched. Nico mentioned how he visited Croatia when he was 6, and being stuck in the Lotus Hotel and Casino helped him transition easier since time passed in a weird way. He was at first reluctant about confiding in Jason, but eventually told him a bit about his past. They went underground and met Favonius, who told Nico that he was watching him since he was a little boy, and asked why he wouldn't allow the truth with the person he cared about most in Tartarus. Jason thought it was Annabeth, and told him admitting his crush would be embarrassing, but it's for the scepter. In reality, Nico felt sick because he had to admit his crush on Percy. Favonius turned them into the wind and took them to Dalmatia, and told Nico if he let anger rule him with Cupid, his fate would be sadder than his. When they land, Nico is terrified and braces himself against a rock, his legs trembling and grass dying under his feet. Jason, who still thinks he's in love with Annabeth, doesn't understand why he's so afraid. Nico stood by Jason when Cupid arrived, and for once, Jason was glad to have Nico there. Jason was pushed down the stairs, but Nico ran to help him up. Nico begged for the scepter after Cupid kept taunting Jason and eventually told him that he wants to pick on him, not Jason, and that he doesn't scare him. Cupid taunted Nico and told him to tell Jason why he left Camp Half-Blood, and why he's always alone, afraid of himself and his feelings, hiding among the dead. He tried to lie and say it was Annabeth and that he left because he didn't belong, but Cupid knew that wasn't the truth and continued to taunt him. Nico screamed, causing skeletons to come from the ground and memories of his life to be seen by Jason, who was shocked by the amount of pain he suffered and quickly realized Nico's feelings were for Percy, not Annabeth. Cupid also taunted him for running away from his friends, and Nico insisted he had none. Nico was nearly reduced to tears and finally admitted that he had a crush on Percy. Cupid gave him the scepter and left, saying that the only way to conquer love is to face it. Jason feels horrible for Nico and thinks Cupid is a cruel monster for forcing him to do such a thing. Jason told him that he won't tell the others, but that they wouldn't judge him and would unleash the fury of the gods on anyone that gave him trouble. Nico denied that he had a crush on anyone and said he was young and impressionable, his voice cracking. Jason remembers Nico is from the 1940s and can't imagine what it had been like for him all those years, keeping an unthinkable secret. Jason comforted him by saying out of everything he had seen, what Nico had done was the bravest. The two then went back to the ship. After that experience, Nico hid even more from everyone, looking to Jason, Piper, and Leo as if expecting an attack from them. Piper knew something big happened in Croatia, but Jason wouldn't tell her. Nico put the scepter below deck because the scepter was making the sea and weather weird. Later, Nico confronts Jason about leaving the palace of the Lord of the South Wind. Nico told him that he sensed Percy getting closer to the doors and that they needed to leave. He was annoyed that he couldn't convince Ouster quicker and noted that he had suffered too many humiliations not to make it in time. Jason attempts to talk to Nico about what had happened previously, saying that the others won't judge him. Nico becomes angry and claims that as a son of Hades, he would never be accepted anywhere and would always be judged, since the only one who accepted him was Bianca and she died. He said that Jason would never understand being a son of Jupiter and favored by everyone. He expressed frustration in having no say in his feelings and being gay. In his anger, the ground opens up and Nico seems to shimmer with ghostly light. Jason then challenges him by saying that he had just been running away and hiding for years, and that he should take a risk and believe that Jason really is his friend. As the scene reaches a climax, Nico tells Jason, "I'm going to honor my promise. I'll take you to Epirus. I'll help you close the doors of death. Then that's it. I'm leaving. Forever." The son of Hades then disappears back into the shadows. Jason had stated multiple times that Nico di Angelo scares him when he gets angry, and began thinking befriending him was more trouble than it's worth. Nico later went with everyone to Malta, where he met with Leo and shook his hand, happy to see him, and looked suspiciously at the people walking down the street. Nico led Leo, Hazel, Fred, Jason, and Piper into the temple, and told the group it's going to get tough. Leo joked about it, annoying Nico. Nico ate the barley and later gave the group the chalice of poison. He offers it to Jason first, telling him that he told him about taking a risk, and asked him how much he trusted him, and Jason drank it without hesitation. They walked through, and Nico could sense that the doors of death opened every 12 minutes, and that Percy and Annabeth were in danger. They attacked monsters and summoned ghosts, and tried to shout orders, but couldn't since he wasn't any Roman rank. Nico told Jason to promote Frank to the praetor, and he did, so Frank could control the ghosts. Frank yelled orders, and Nico genuinely smiled and laughed, saying, "That's more like it, let's turn this tide." Nico kept raising the dead and legionnaires with the scepter. When the battle ended, Nico calmly told Frank that he had an arrow in his arm. Nico, Jason, Piper, and Frank went to find Hazel and Leo and arrived with their swords drawn, and Nico used his sword to absorb the darkness. When the battle ended, Nico went to Hazel and kissed her forehead. Hazel cupped Nico's face, realizing that he had been crying. Nico had everyone hold hands and shadow travel away with the help of Hazel. Nico realized he was holding Percy's hand and immediately pulled away. Nico and the others ate dinner with Reyna, and Nico decided to go with Reyna and Hedge to bring the Athena Parthenos back to Camp Half-Blood, and went to get ready. Nico tied the statue up with rope to attach to himself. In the Blood of Olympus, Nico recounts on a conversation with Annabeth he had on this day. Annabeth approached him, saying she needed to talk. Nico immediately panicked, thinking she knows, meaning he was afraid she had found out he was gay, but she only thanked him. Later, Percy comes to thank him for keeping his promise. Nico says Percy doesn't have to thank him, and Percy's a little hurt that Nico's being so cold and distant. When Annabeth wishes him good luck, Percy notes that Nico won't meet her eye. He then shadow travels away with Reyna and Coach Hedge. The Blood of Olympus. Nico shadow traveled with Reyna and Hedge to Albania, and something humiliating occurred, something that they all agreed never to mention again. 2 days later, he shadow travels himself, Reyna, and Hedge into the air above Mount Vesuvius, and they nearly fall in. But Reyna lends him enough strength to shadow travel down into the city of Pompeii, after which he sleeps for about a day. When he finally wakes up just after sunset, he wolfs down a sandwich and talks with Hedge and Reyna about Reyna's dreams. He mentions that he thinks he could make it to Spain when Gaia possesses Hedge and sends dirt-encrusted ghosts of Pompeii to attack them. Reyna tells him to summon dead legionnaires to their aid with Diocletian's scepter, and he does so, but the scepter starts smoking and then explodes in his hands. He straps himself onto the harness of the Athena Parthenos, carrying Hedge, while Reyna holds the ghosts off and shadow travels just moments after Reyna grabs his hand. Nico passes out after shadow traveling. While he's out, he dreams about his life in Venice, Bianca and him in the mall in Washington, D.C., and Percy shielding him from Dr. Thorne. He's pulled to Hypnos' cabin by the dreams of Clovis, who shows him that day's war meeting at Camp Half-Blood, which shows that the Greeks are cornered in by the Romans and preparing for the invasion. In the dream, he sees Chiron, Rachel Dare, Grover Underwood, and several campers, Clarice LaRue, Jake Mason, Butch Walker, Connor Stoll, Malcolm Pace, and Will Solace. Will's blonde hair and blue eyes remind Nico of Jason, but says these similarities stop there. He describes Will as a lanky cat stretched out in the sunshine, and says although he is relaxed and non-threatening, Nico knows Will is brave in battle. After telling Clovis to pass a message on to Thalia Grace, he's woken up by Coach Hedge 36 hours after passing out. Hedge informs him that they overshot Spain and went to Portugal instead, and that the Athena Parthenos was on top of a temple. Hedge then tells him a ghost is asking to talk to him. Nico goes to the ghost, who leads him to a church that is decorated on the inside with the bones of deceased monks. There he meets his father, who tells Nico that his quest is hard and that he might not survive the trip. He also tells them that Orion and his pack are hunting Nico, Reyna, and Hedge, and that one of the 7 will die. Before Nico can ask more questions, Hades vanishes. He goes back to the temple and has lunch with his companions. Suddenly, Lycaon and his pack surround them. He informs them that he is going to kill them for Orion. However, Orion wanted him to detain Nico. Nico summons bones from the ground to imprison the wolves momentarily, while the 3 ran towards the Athena Parthenos. When the werewolf breaks free and attacks Nico, Nico stabs him in the chest with Reyna's silver knife, getting clawed in the process, and uses the shadow left by Lycaon to shadow travel away. After Portugal, Nico shadow travels to a cruise ship in the middle of the Atlantic for a day, where he discarded his aviator's jacket due to the damage it took, and Reyna patched up his gashes. He then travels to San Juan, Puerto Rico, 10 feet above a restaurant. After he goes to sleep, Reyna puts her backpack under his head. However, her hand passes through his head on her first attempt and lifts it the second. When Nico awakens to find Reyna gone and a note from the hunters, he tore the note up in a fit of rage. Later, he and Hedge put on new, colorful tourist shirts, much to his annoyance, before joining the fight against Orion. Once the 2 meet up with Reyna and Thalia, Nico, Reyna, and Hedge retreat to continue their quest. 2 days later, the trio shadow travels to Beaufort, South Carolina. While Nico and Hedge go to the Zippy Mart for supplies, Reyna stays behind to watch over camp. When the boys come back to base camp, Hedge goes to write letters while Nico and Reyna talk. She tells him about her father and family history. In return, Nico told her about his relationship with his father, and that cheered her up a bit. Just then, Bryce Lawrence shows up and summons British redcoat skeletons to apprehend Reyna and kill Nico and Hedge. He threatens to torture Hedge to death and taunts Reyna about her secret about her father. This infuriates Nico, whose temper explodes. He proceeds to unleash all his painful memories since falling into Tartarus on the others at the camp, revealing his secret in the process. As the temperatures drop to freezing and the skeletons dissolve, Nico marches over to Bryce and opens a fissure beneath the boy's feet, and as Bryce sinks into the ground, Nico turns him, body and all, into a ghost and sends him to the Underworld. After that, he collapses, nearly fading away into a shadow because of overuse of his powers, and wakes up with Hedge and Reyna bandaging him. They had managed to save him through Hedge's sports medicine and nature magic. They tell him what happened with Bryce, and to his shock, they tell him that they still trust him. Moments later, a flock of Pegasi arrives to help them take the Athena Parthenos to Camp Half-Blood, led by Pegasus himself. The flock flies Nico and his companions to Cap Half-Blood by the pre-dawn of August 1st. They land on a yacht, and Nico sends some strong dreams to the mortals below deck, much to Reyna's awe. Soon after, Michael Kahali, Layla from the 4th cohort, and Dakota from the 5th cohort come to arrest Reyna and bring in Nico to be executed as an enemy spy. Hedge attacks the son of Venus to little success, but then the people on the boat hear the voice of Octavian, saying he had come to see the arrests himself. Seconds later, Tyson, who presumably imitated Octavian's voice, and Ella knock out the 1st cohort Centurions. The other 2 Centurions decide to help Reyna and declare their loyalty to her. They tell Reyna what their base camp is like, and she sends them to get their cohorts to leave Octavian, and Nico to sabotage the Legion. After they arrive at a private dock and haul Michael Kahali out of the boat, they wonder who will drive the SUV, and Nico volunteers, much to their shock and nerves. He then summons Jules Albert to drive the SUV through the Roman ranks. When they arrive, they see that the Legion is outnumbered by monsters. Dakota and Layla get out to get their cohorts to switch sides, while Nico goes to sabotage the siege weapons. When he shadow travels to Half-Blood Hill, he is startled by Will Solace, Lou Ellen, and Cecil, who are spying on the Romans. Will and Nico immediately start bickering, Nico being annoyed that Will is ordering him not to use his underworld powers. Nico also notes that Will doesn't back down from Nico in fear like others do, and seems annoyingly determined. While talking to Will, Nico remembers when he first arrived at Camp Half-Blood with Apollo years before, and Thalia Grace calling Apollo hot, but quickly shakes the random memory. The 4 were successful in sabotaging half the weapons before being spotted. Octavian then comes out with the 1st cohort. Nico states that he's helping both camps and that he will leave once the war is over. Will is upset by this and tells Nico that a lot of campers want to be his friend. Dakota and the 5th cohort arrive while the rest of the cohorts are surrounded by monsters. Moments later, Camp Half-Blood is led to battle by Clarice LaRue, Grover Underwood, Tyson, and Chiron. They're all stunned by Will's whistle, and Nico speaks of peace as Reyna flies the Athena Parthenos into camp as a peace offering. This works until Gaia awakes. As the 7 arrive at camp, Nico is helping fight the monsters. During the battle, Will comes over to him and whispers Octavian in his ear before leading him to an onager where Octavian is preparing to blast Gaia. Will and Nico try to talk him out of it, noticing that the imperial gold he's wearing seems to be attracted to the loaded projectile and is snagged, but he refuses to listen. Will continues to try to talk him out of it, but Nico tells him that some deaths cannot be prevented. Octavian then fires and gets dragged along with the shot. They witness Leo's sacrifice, but Nico senses that Leo's death was strange. He talks with Percy, Annabeth, Jason, Piper, Hazel, and Frank at the big house, where Frank and Hazel explain Leo's plan tearfully. Chiron asks him to perform the final rites for the fallen demigods, and Nico agrees. He hadn't spoken to Will since the battle, thinking the son of Apollo would think Nico a monster for having let Octavian die. Later, he sits by the campfire and listens as Chiron explains how the 2 camps have become friends and that they can now visit each other's camp. Then Reyna tells the 2 camps about Nico's part in saving the camps, bringing him out of the shadows, and hugs him, and he tearfully returns it. The next morning, Jason knocks on Nico's door. For a second, Nico thought he was Will Solace and was disappointed when he realized he wasn't, getting angry with himself for feeling that way. Jason and Nico go outside to talk. During this conversation, Nico tells Jason that he will stay at Camp Half-Blood. Nico is then called over by Will, who angrily asks him where he was for the past few days, saying he would have enjoyed having Nico around to help him or just as a friendly face. He then tells him to stay in the infirmary for at least 3 days, which made Nico feel like 100 skeletal butterflies were resurrecting in his stomach. Nico then sees Percy and Annabeth and walks over. They tell him they will attend college and live in New Rome. Nico then tells Percy he had a crush on him, but he's now over him, earning him Percy's shock and a high five from Annabeth before Nico goes back to Will. Between the series. Several days after the deaths of Gaia and Leo, a parchment scroll with a holographic message sent from the resurrected Leo came fluttering into Camp Half-Blood on the wind, with Nico being the one to keep it in his jacket's pocket after the other campers had finished re-listening to it. While extremely relieved after learning of Leo's survival, due to him having blamed himself for Leo's death and unable to forgive himself, Nico is also enraged at Leo for scaring him, so he looks at the scroll whenever he wants to get angry at Leo. At some point during the ensuing months, Nico finally comes out and confesses to Will Solace, son of Apollo, about having a strong crush on the latter, and the 2 begin dating. In order to sit together with his new boyfriend during meals, Nico claims to Chiron that he somewhat loses control of his infernal powers while sitting alone at the Hades cabin table, and so he is therefore given permission to sit at the Apollo cabin's table instead. As Will produced a handy fake doctor's note, and Chiron decided it wasn't worth arguing about. At one point, he and Will accidentally shadow traveled to the largest cheese whiz factory in Venezuela. By September, however, most of Nico's friends temporarily leave camp, with Percy and Annabeth returning to New York to spend their senior school year together, while Jason and Piper depart a month later, spending most of September searching for Leo to spend their school year in Los Angeles with Trista McClane, also taking Gleason Hedge, Melly, and Chuck along with them. It can also be assumed that Nico is rarely visited by Hazel and Frank, as he describes them being busy doing the 12th Legion thing at Camp Jupiter. The Hidden Oracle. Nico meets Apollo, Will Solace, and Meg McCaffrey at the Big House. Nico donned a new outfit, a Ramones t-shirt that Apollo liked for music taste, black pants, and a leather jacket. Nico told the fallen god that he had a thick aura and a great possibility of death around him. Will told Nico that he needed another talk for people skills and apologized for his boyfriend's behavior, getting an eye roll and a "can you not" from Nico. Will asked for what he preferred instead of boyfriend, suggesting special guy and significant other, and Nico said significant annoyance. Meg noted that they fought a lot. After discussing problems at camp, Chiron ordered the two boys to get the other campers for dinner and to go together using the buddy system. Will asked if Nico wanted to be his buddy, and Nico called him a dork. Apollo was supportive of his son's relationship with Nico. At dinner, Nico sat with Will, Apollo, Austin, and Kayla. Apollo thought Will and Nico were so cute together it looked desolate, reminding him of his old relationship with Hyacinthus. Nico explained to Apollo that he had a doctor's note to sit with Will at dinner and that Will was his doctor. Nico also told Apollo the whereabouts of the Seven and Gleason Hedge. When Apollo asked about Leo, Nico said that if he saw him again, he'd kill him. Nico showed Apollo the scroll Leo sent and said he looked at it whenever he got angry, and how he hated being left in the dark because he didn't know if he was safe or planning anything. While Chiron talked about the three-legged death race, Nico chastised Will for staring at Paolo's arms, but Will was just saying he was making sure they were working after surgery. Nico also told Apollo that Grover was in California with the Council of Cloven Elders. When Peaches came, Nico told Meg to stay out of the way because he was dangerous. Nico bowed down respectively when Meg was claimed by Demeter. The next day, at the three-legged death race, Will and Nico were partners tied together. After Will said that he missed Grover and rested his arm on Nico's shoulder, as if the son of Hades were a convenient shelf, as Apollo put it, Nico pushed it off and said that he'd settle for Coach Hedge, and not to talk about Grover so loudly since Juniper was nearby. After the race, Nico helped a stressed-out Will reattach Paolo's leg and gave Will water, saying that was where he needed to be. Nico was angry about the missing campers and the grass withered around him. Will asked him if he wanted to set Valentina's arm, and Nico said it sounded gruesome, but did it. Later, when Meg and Apollo went to find the Grove of Dodona, Nico gathered with Will, Malcolm, Paolo, and Billy for a going-away party. Nico gave Apollo ambrosia for Meg because he could sense that she had a chance of death, making Apollo shiver. Nico smirked when Paolo gave Apollo his bandana and listened to what he said because he understood Brazilian Portuguese. Nico explained that it was Paolo's good luck bandana and that he believed it would make Apollo invincible. When Apollo showed up to camp at 6 in the morning, they took him to Apollo's cabin to heal him. They wanted to search for Meg in the woods, but Chiron wouldn't let them. When Apollo woke up and started talking with the flowers, Nico was concerned and asked Will if that was normal. Nico told Apollo that he and Will were worried and put his hand on Will's shoulder. Apollo told Nico that Meg had until that night at the latest and went to get dressed, and Nico wanted to help him, saying that he could shadow travel him there, but Apollo told him to protect the camp. Apollo told him that Nero and the other Roman emperors were alive and divine and ran out of the room, leaving Nico in shock. Later, Nico and Will were capsized in the middle of a canoe ride while the Colossus Nerones attacked. He and Will rushed to Apollo during the battle and chatted with him. When Apollo asked for his children to come with him, Nico went with them too because he had a doctor's note. Nico then grabbed Will's hand and shadow traveled to steal Sherman's chariot, where he convinced Alice, Julia, and Sherman to get off so he could steal it. Austin said he hated it when Nico shadow traveled. They landed the chariot near Apollo, with Nico half conscious. Sherman was angry that Nico stole his chariot and screamed from the distance. Nico passed out in Will's arms, and Will took him to get Gatorade. Nico was affected by the hay fever epidemic. Percy later mentioned that he almost lost Nico to the enemy. Later, when Nico returned to camp with Festus and Calypso, Nico ordered a line from the snack bar to punch Leo, where Leo questioned if it was really necessary. When Calypso mentioned Albania, Nico said not to mention Albania. When the line was over, Leo asked Nico if he was done with the physical abuse, and Nico smiled and said that at Camp Jupiter, there were many people who wanted to punch him. Leo winced and asked where they could get lunch. Nico later prepared marshmallows for s'mores for the bonfire on femur bones. The Dark Prophecy. Apollo mentioned Nico when seeing Marcus, the new second in command of Nero. The Tyrant's Tomb. Hazel Levesque mentions Nico when thinking he could help cure Apollo's scratch. Apollo mentions him when thinking his condition cannot be cured with the combined efforts of him, Will, and Pranjal. He is also glad he's not at Camp Jupiter. The Tower of Nero. After sensing Jason's death, Nico starts to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Around the same time, he starts to hear voices calling his name from Tartarus. He talks to Will about it, and Will tells him to speak with Dionysus. He and Will are on the porch of the big house drinking lemonade when Apollo and Meg return to camp after 6 months. He asks about Jason's death, and they silently confirm it. He stands in silent shock for a moment before saying "excuse me" in Italian and running away. Will says that he only slips into Italian when he's really upset. The following morning, Apollo asks Will why Nico isn't at the table, and Will points to the head table, where Nico is having breakfast with Dionysus. Will explains Nico's spiral after Jason's death and his PTSD, and Apollo notes that Will seems very concerned about his boyfriend. Will talks about the voice Nico had been hearing from Tartarus, and says he's working with Dionysus, god of madness, to figure out what's real and what isn't. Will also says that if the voice is real, he and Nico plan to go into Tartarus together. Dionysus calls Apollo and Will over to the head table. Meg joins them and they try to make meaning of the prophecy. Will puts an apple on Nico's plate and tells him to eat something, but the apple responds to Nico's emotions and starts to wither, and Nico leans into Will for comfort. It's revealed that Will didn't tell Nico about the line of the prophecy mentioning a son of Hades, likely because he didn't want Nico to be put in danger, which upset Nico. When they mention the part about him being the cavern runner's friend, Nico knows what it means and gets supplies to meet up with them, with Will reluctantly helping. The following morning, he and Will go with Apollo and Meg to Brooklyn. Argus drops them off a block away from Rachel's house, and they walk the rest of the way. When they arrive, Rachel hurries them in as the cows are watching. She takes them to her room. When Nico compliments her paintings, she playfully pushes him away and warns him about getting color on his clothes. Rachel explains that 3 cattle cars full of neglected livestock arrived at her house on the previous day, and when she contacted the authorities, they denied seeing anything. They then changed the topic to Nero. She confirms that the fasces is on a heavily fortified floor in the center of the tower with the holding cells. Nico asks Meg why Lugaselwa is having them destroy it if she's unable to. After Rachel talks about an underground filtration system that could pump Greek fire into the city's sewer system, he reveals that his friends are troglodytes, expert tunnelers who can get in and sabotage the system without Nero ever knowing. Will is against it, but Nico mentions that this is part of their quest. Soon after, Rachel utters a prophecy in Python's voice and passes out just as the cattle break into the property. They escape just as the mansion collapses and make their way to a construction site with a 50-foot pit. They jump onto a nearby crane just as some of the cattle, which Apollo realizes are the troglodytes' natural enemy, Tauri sylvestris, fall into the pit and choke to death on their anger. As the others question if they can fight them off or if Nero is coming for them, he sees a cluster of shadows he can use to get them away. When they climb down, he says he can only take 2 with him at a time, and as one of the bulls slides into the pit, Apollo and Meg volunteer Rachel and Will. He takes the 2 and returns for Apollo and Meg. He brings them to an underground cavern and promptly falls asleep. Will props a travel pillow under his head and explains that he needs about half an hour to recover from the shadow traveling. When he regains consciousness, he's confused, and Will gently tells him that he's with friends. He leads the others to the troglodytes and tells them not to touch their weapons. He asks Will to do his thing, which turned out to be the power to glow with golden light. Nico happily calls Will his glow-in-the-dark boyfriend. When he announces their presence, the troglodytes surround him. Screechbling, their leader, asks Nico if they're sacrifices. He says that they are not and offers him a skink, a rare treat for his people, and they're brought to their camp. He and Will sit together, and Will expresses his concern about their situation, to which Nico replies with words of assurance. He then speaks with Screechbling as dinner's being prepared. As they eat, they're given hats, with the son of Hades receiving a top hat. Apollo and Rachel help him make a case to help save the city above. The troglodytes agree, but become angered that the forest bulls followed them. During the chaos, Nico, Will, and Rachel are separated from Apollo and Meg. Nico and the troglodytes sabotage the filtration system. He makes his way to the main levels of Nero's tower and saves Apollo by killing the guy about to kill the god. He informs Apollo that the building is under attack and that the others are off fighting. He walks the mortal god through a confidence room where mortals are fighting the troglodytes. They meet up with the forces of Camp Half-Blood. He passes Apollo over to Kayla as he goes to look for Will. At some point before he's seen by Apollo again, he either finds a dead forest bull or kills it himself, taking control of the bull's skeleton. At Rachel's urging, he goes to the throne room. He goes to Apollo and Meg and informs them that the troglodytes are still searching for the gas as he takes out 2 cynocephali. As Nero searches for the right remote to trigger the gas, Nico takes on numerous Germani before charging at Nero himself. However, the God Emperor catches his sword and throws it aside before slapping Nico away and knocking him unconscious. Right after, Will, Rachel, Screechbling, and Lou arrive with the fasces. Will screams that no one hits his boyfriend and no one kills his dad. He helps Nico up, yelling at the enemies to move so he can take him to the side safely. He heals Nico as Apollo and Nero fight over the fasces, and both see the Emperor disintegrate. After Nero's death, Nico and Will help Apollo recover and prepare for his fight with Python. When Apollo and Will send Nico to get the ukulele as well as the bow and arrow, he questions if they really hate Python so much as to subject him to that. Will simply raises an eyebrow and Nico runs off to comply. He gives Apollo a reassuring look as the former god leaves to take on Python. 2 weeks later after the campfire, Apollo, having regained his full divinity, sits with Nico, Will, and Rachel and watches the embers burn down. The 2 boys sit comfortably next to each other. Will's arm is around Nico's shoulder, and Nico is twirling a burnt marshmallow on a stick. Rachel confirms that Python's death restored her powers. She discusses taking a gap year in Paris to study art, but she promises to be back the next summer to continue her work as the Oracle of Delphi. Nico promises that if they ever need her, he can shadow travel her to camp. Will comments that he'd love to think that Nico is planning a date night in Paris, but knows that he's really hoping for prophetic guidance about Tartarus. Nico simply calls it unfinished business. Apollo remembers Nico telling him about his compulsion to explore the depths of Tartarus and a voice calling out to him for help. Apollo questions if it could be Jason. Nico admits he's considered that, along with trying to bring Jason back, but he's sure that it's not about him. Nico has a sense that Jason made his choice. If Nico tried to bring Jason back, he wouldn't be honoring Jason's sacrifice. Resurrecting Jason would not be like resurrecting Hazel, who needed to come back. Nico senses that Jason is in a better place now, though Apollo can't confirm if it is Elysium or Rebirth. Nico explains that the first time he was in Tartarus, someone helped them and later helped Percy and Annabeth, but he got left down there and Nico can't stop thinking about him. Will asks if he should be jealous until Nico states that it's a Titan, Iapetus, surprising Apollo. Nico calls it a long story and insists that Iapetus isn't a bad guy. Nico feels like he should look for Iapetus and try to find out what happened to him in case his friend needs his help. Though Hades has expressly forbidden traveling to Tartarus ever again, Nico plans to use the troglodytes, who can tunnel even to Tartarus and can get him and Will in and out safely. Apollo, even though he dislikes the idea, admits that though he wishes he could help them, he can't as it is outside his jurisdiction. Will takes Nico's hand and promises that it's fine and Apollo has already done his part. Just as Will asserts that they will succeed with or without a prophecy, Rachel suddenly tips over. Will and Nico catch her and she issues a prophecy that only they can hear. Nico asks if Apollo heard the prophecy. Apollo admits that he didn't and probably shouldn't. Will agrees, stating that what Rachel told them doesn't sound good. Un Natale Mezzosangue. Nico takes Percy to Florence after the son of Poseidon struggles with finding a gift for Annabeth. The son of Hades takes him to a store owned by Caru, the last of the Etruscan gods. After asking questions about Annabeth, he gives the son of Poseidon a bracelet of keys and asks him to explain the meaning of Christmas. After Percy explains the universal meaning of friendship and family behind the holiday, he's given the gift and the demigods leave. Did you enjoy our video? Be sure to check out these other great videos from the Amagi, and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.